First of all, thank you. This is our first big event of this term, at least with the Global Health Fellows. I know a bunch of the other groups have been together already, so welcome. And I'm super excited about what we're going to talk about. For those of you who saw some of the mailers, it's called Round the Girdled Earth Career Panels. And we actually are linked up with the fabulous people at Alumni Relations. If Alumni Relations people, raise your hands. We've got a couple of them here in the audience. Thank you. And the idea being, we want you to be connected with more people who are doing some of the work that you might want to do postgraduate, or maybe even as an internship. So this is our first one, and we hope it's the first of many. I also want to start with a little bit of, I'm sorry, Miguel Rodriguez could not join us tonight, so he will not be here. If you have questions for him, I'd be happy to pass along connection information to him, and then you could get in touch with him directly. So thanks so much. All right, so in addition to a thank you to Alumni Relations, I also want to thank the incredible Dickey team that has made this happen. We're being live streamed right now, and so hello to all of our alums, recent alums, and not so recent alums who are watching us from afar. Thank you. As I said, this is the first of many international career panel events we're going to do, and at least now, I want them to be more conversational. Sort of like if you were sitting down at a table and there happened to be a couple of people who are doing something you're interested in, you get to chat with them. So we'll start off. I've got a couple of some easy questions, some not so easy questions that I'll tee up after I introduce. And then we're going to open up the conversation more broadly to you and to the folks who are online. Okay? If you have a question, write it down. We're going to try to keep the flow going for a bit, and then we will move to you. So I want to talk a little bit about who you are, but I want you to tell me who you are as well throughout these next hour or so. And I'm going to do it by blueprinting. I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am, and then you can follow up. So I'm Dawn Carey, for those of you who haven't met me yet. I work at the Dickey Center. Thank you. Appreciate the fandom. I get to be the queen of global health and development at Dickey Center, one of the three main pillars. There are also folks here from GIS. You are pre-pillar, as we like to say. So as you're thinking about different pillars, think about global health. It's the best pillar. I majored in anthropology and religion when I was here. My freshman dorm, and actually pretty much my only dorm, was Woodward. It was one of two all-female dorms at the time. I don't think there are any all-female dorms anymore. The other one was North Mass. That's where I lived. My favorite place to study was in my room. My most effective place to study was in the stacks, far away, without telling them where I was, because if I was in my room, I was just chit-chatting and didn't really get a lot of studying done. Some of the work I did leading up to this was really connected with something called the Gates Foundation. Perhaps you've heard of it. I get to marshal something called the Gates Award for Global Health. And what it allowed me to do is go around the world and seek out best practices that different organizations were doing in low and middle income settings and help disseminate that to other parts of the world. It was a pretty wonderful job. It also really opened my eyes. I had spent the bulk of my time in the United States up to that point, or at least in a westernized setting. And so for me, that was really the eye-opening time, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Sarah Geitner, here. Hello. Serves as an independent consultant with the USAID and World Bank. She works in post-crisis international community development, and we're going to ask her a little bit about her Dartmouth background and what she's done. Yeah.
Dartmouth background in terms of what you shared. I lived in Topliff. Like Dawn, I didn't deviate very much, but only when I was at Dartmouth. I spent a lot of time away from Dartmouth, which is one of the reasons I came, only because of the opportunities that Dartmouth afforded me. Place to study, it depends what I was studying. If I was doing Chinese, it was the O2 room. If I was writing, it might have been the Tower room, and it just depended.
Love that. Tell me a little bit about what you've been doing up to this point.
So I just got back from Uganda on Friday night, where I was and continue to be, helping formulate the World Bank Group's strategy for Uganda for the next 5 years, 6 years. it was probably a particularly interesting time because, as some of you may know, during the middle of my visit, Parliament passed a extraordinarily repressive anti-homosexuality law that we're waiting to see if the president signs or not, and waiting to see what the impacts of that are on the country, on the bank's work, on everything else.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to our other lovely distinguished guest. This is Matthew Huggins. He works at the International Finance Corporation, which is also part of the World Bank. And your focus is on international development law, which, just so you know, I didn't really know was a thing until we started talking. So tell us more. And your Dartmouth setting.
Thanks. So since neither of you said it, we happen to all be from the same class, quite by accident. I lived in the Choate in Bissell, which I note was last renovated 10 years before I started at Dartmouth. I was a German major, and currently, so I've been down in Washington, D.C. I'm a lawyer. I went to law school after spending some time working after college. I moved to Washington 25 years ago or so. And in contrast to you, I'm kind of like an auto mechanic. I focus on lots and lots of nitty-gritty, nuts and bolts things that help our organization continue to function in the area of private sector development, finance. So much of what I do isn't particularly sexy, but just like the auto mechanic for the Lamborghini runs because there's an auto mechanic who can keep it in working order. So,
are you telling us the World Bank is a Lamborghini? I just want to, we're live streaming here.
It's more, I would think more like a Maserati, but they're trying to make it more like a Tesla.
Oh, good answer. More importantly, what was your favorite place to study when you were here?
Well, I was in my room kind of guy.
Oh, I love that. That's perfect. So we're going to go a little bit further. And so you all are knee-deep right now in your Dartmouth experience, which is great. And a lot of that has to do with classwork. A lot of it has to do with some of these extracurriculars, et cetera. And at every moment, you're thinking to yourself, am I doing enough? Am I doing the right thing? Am I on the path that I'm supposed to be? So we are going to do two things. We're going to disabuse you of the idea that there is a right path. That's our main goal. Am I right? And the second part is talk a little bit about some of our paths, and then that gives you a little bit of context for what you might be thinking about what you're doing. I think I'll kick it off by saying, I was originally a chemistry major and realized I didn't like doing the same exact thing over and over every single day, so perhaps science wasn't going to be my gift to the world. I loved religion and anthropology because it was about stories. About people's stories. And some of you have been at some of the talks where I talk about stories and how I think that's really the main section of health in general. And when I started working for something called the Global Health Council, where I was working with Gates Foundation, that was the piece that came to me, going and hearing people's stories. And that's going to drive me for the rest of my life. Is I love hearing your stories. I love hearing you coming back and telling me other people's stories. And I think being a listener is one of the most powerful things you can do if you're going to work internationally or if you're going to work over in White River Junction. So I would say, for me, the Dartmouth element that stuck with me the most and the international was really getting a good idea of the framework of what does a story look like? What is it? What is its power, I would say. Sarah, how about you for Dartmouth and moving on to what you're doing now? It doesn't have to be a straight line. It can be hodgepodge.
Yeah, and it was, though I think I also differ because I grew up overseas. My father was international development. It's what I lived. It's what I knew. So in that sense, it wasn't that hard to figure out what I wanted to do. So I was a government Asian studies major. Again, spent a fair amount of time. I spent some time in Taiwan. I spent some time at the London School of Economics my senior year. Everything was fairly development focused, to the extent that when it came time to take that first job afterwards, I knew I was going to Washington. Most of my friends were going to New York. I took an internship, which apparently still exists, which is the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, to which I think institutions nominate somebody. So I went for the 6 months that internship gave me, and then I went to work on Capitol Hill for a couple of years. I hadn't spent a lot of time in the U.S. growing up, and so that gave me a kind of window into how the U.S. worked. At that point, I'd applied to graduate school, which we can also talk about if and when relevant for anybody. But I was trying to make some choices, so I deferred, and one of the choices I really, there were a couple choices even at that point that I thought I had to make. I'm not sure I was right, but maybe it felt like I was right. One was kind of this policy versus development choice. Do I go kind of work in Washington on the policy side, or do I do kind of more typical international development work, both in the field and strategy-wise, but also kind of hands-on? The other decision I was faced with was I going to do China, or was I going to do more than China? Because to focus on China seemed to require a pretty dedicated focus. I mean, language-wise, it was a long time ago. Things were just they were more than opening up. Dartmouth had run the first programs in China, first international programs. I chose not to go and went to Taiwan instead, partly because that was my big, reactionary something or other. That's as dramatic as it got. But Taiwan had also been the place that had taught Chinese to, international students much longer. So had a phenomenal experience in Taiwan. And anyway, so I deferred to graduate school and went and spent the year in China to kind of figure that out. A lot of things happened that year. I don't think it's that binary. But one thing that happened is the spring of 1989, Gorbachev came for the Sino-Soviet summit, and then Tiananmen ensued. So an internship with a consulting firm segued into working for ABC News because they needed anyone they could get their hands on to try to figure out what story they were telling. And that window into journalism and how it works was fascinating. I was a pretty highly prized commodity because I had a multi-entry visa. And when the Chinese government shut down internet, any satellite communication, there was no internet, satellite communications, they needed people to run videotape outside of China in order to broadcast the story to the world. So there were several ways to do that. We had a big board of all the flights and how late, because you wanted to get the latest story out. And you could fly into Hong Kong, but then it took a couple days to turn around a visa to fly back in. And because I had a multi-entry visa, I could do the Tokyo run and then get right back on a plane. So I spent several weeks with videotapes, flying them to Tokyo to the airport, and where ABC had set up an office like most, and they were then transmitted, and then I'd get back on a plane, and I'd go back. And curiously, the Chinese government didn't really question me. The Japanese, after the third visit, said, "What are you doing here? Why do you keep flying back and forth?" And then I came back to the U.S. and went to graduate school, and didn't focus on China after that, not because it wasn't that deliberate a choice. I think just the world kind of opened up. And after graduate school, I went right to West Africa, partly because I was following the person who became my husband, and he was a year ahead of me, and so he got a job, and he said, "Well, what should I do? Do I go to Korea and teach English, and do I take this job, or do I stay in the U.S.?" I said, "Well, of course you go overseas. I mean, who wouldn't? And if you go, I'll come." And so, he went, and I followed a year later, and didn't stop for a while until about 10 years ago, where I came back here, where my kids finally said, my oldest was in high school and said, "I kind of want to go to America." So back we came.
That's amazing. And you just eclipsed anything that Matthew and I are ever going to be able to say. Just so we can just stop now.
Questions?
Exactly. That's so badass. I just have to say that. I hear you, and yes. Anyway, Matthew, so German major, and... So
the thing that I did at Dartmouth that was the most fun, it's still some of the most fun I ever had, was I was a teaching assistant for the German department. So I did the drill classes that I believe they still have. And that was the most fun I had in college. And I think that was fun for me because I loved the teaching part, but I was really interested in languages. And I kind of continued, actually, for a long time, trying to figure out how to meld those two things. So my first job out of college, I worked for a German commercial bank down on Wall Street. And that's maybe maybe I'll go to one of your questions. That didn't go so well. And so I found myself, a couple years out of college, I left that job. I was doing temporary office work in New York. All my friends were either in law school or business school or med school, and I was doing, filing. But that sort of, serendipity, or whatever you call it, led to a job teaching high school in Manhattan at Regis High School, and the famous Regis High School grad you will have heard of is Anthony Fauci. So I did that for 4 years. Realized I loved it, but didn't want it. That wasn't like a teaching, especially high school teaching. You should go, when you get back, go write a letter to your high school teachers and thanking them. Because the ones, especially the ones that are career people, that's a tough career to do for your whole job, for your whole life. I realized that wasn't going to be a 30-year career for me, so I left that. I went traveling, and I went to Spain for half a year. I decided I'm going to learn Spanish. And one of the reasons I was able to do that was because I had studied German in Dartmouth, and I kind of had a good sense of how you learned a language. So I'm like, well, I'll just take myself off to Spain. I went to Salamanca, where Dartmouth at the time had a program. I don't know if they still do. So anyhow, and when I was there, I decided, what's my next step? And so I decided to take the LSAT in Madrid. And anybody who's ever been to Spain knows that the Spanish are on a much different time schedule than the rest of the world, right? So, they have they have lunch around 5 p.m., they have dinner around 10:30, 11. And that's just how they roll. And so the LSAT was supposed to be given, that they deliver it around the world at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. Until they realize that, nothing is open. The metro isn't open at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. So there was the only place they had to shift it to 2 p.m. because otherwise, the janitor wouldn't be there to open the door of the building. So, make a long story short, I applied to law school. I got in. I went. And when I got out of law school, I kept thinking about my love of languages, and I did an internship at a law firm in Argentina. I ultimately ended up at a law firm in Washington in a practice that focused on representing companies investing primarily in Latin America. I did that for a while until the downturn of around 2002 was tough for that business, but I stayed at that firm until I found out about a job at the World Bank. So that was in 2004. There's a branch of the World Bank called MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, that writes political risk insurance for private sector investments in emerging markets. And then I moved over 2 years later to where I work now, which is the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector development arm of the World Bank. We make investments in private sector companies in emerging markets for poverty reduction purposes to complement the work of the World Bank. And back to my, auto mechanic metaphor, and I know that I get lots of questions from people asking about law school. That's maybe the metaphor I've come up with for the afternoon is, being a lawyer is a little bit like being a good auto mechanic. You end up solving lots of problems. You have to change spark plugs, you have to change oil and rotate tires, but only by doing that can big organizations run, and the longer you do that, the bigger cars you work on, and you end up, understanding and being able to help institutions navigate things. But anyhow, that's maybe back to you, Nar.
That's great. I was thinking about how there are different mechanics for foreign cars and domestic cars, and thinking how you were able to navigate that. We'll get to that, I think, at some point. I want to talk a little bit about barriers. We're talking about successes. You alluded to a couple of little challenges here and there. As I said earlier, growing up in the United States gave me, although I lived in many different parts of the United States, I had not really spent a lot of time outside of the country except for Mexico. And I would say that my biggest barrier in navigating was letting go of what my worldview was when I would go into other settings. And what do I mean by that? We all carry around a set of rules in our head of what is right and what is wrong. And in general, we have pretty good moral compasses if we're here at this point. And I think the thing that was the most challenging for me was early on, especially going in and not understanding the depth of challenges other people were having and not being able. You're probably looking at me like, what are you talking about? Because you spent your whole life doing this, and that was, I think, for me, the first challenge. And just sitting with that for as long as you can. I think before you go, thinking about being reflective while you're doing it, and more importantly, when you get back, talking it out. We talk about this a lot when Peter puts together his our pre-departure trips and whatnot, is really thinking about that. You're going to be in this completely different setting. The other thing for me was, and this is, I know, a little bit ageist in a way, but for me, it was being a woman. I would travel with these amazing camera crews all around the world, recording all of this amazing work that other people were doing, and I could never be by myself oftentimes, and that was really hard for me because there were my male colleagues that could go and do that without fear of any concern whatsoever. So I would say those are my two biggest barriers, especially at the beginning. How about you, Matthew? You're talking about working at a bank in Argentina. This was after you just taught yourself Spanish. There's so much in that. Tell me a little bit about that culturally. What was that like?
Well, it's interesting. That's not something I ever thought of as a barrier, but actually, it's interesting. And that was one of the things that I got from. So when I was at Dartmouth, I did one of the foreign. So they were called LSA, the language study abroad programs in Germany, and I kind of developed then a sense that when you go into a foreign country, you kind of have to be a little bit of a sponge. You got to look at stuff. And just be ready to kind of accept stuff in a way that you might not in your own country. In fact, I personally find it very tedious when people from other countries come to the United States and they complain about stuff. I'm like, it's how we do stuff. I'm sorry. But I also think it's super tedious when you travel abroad, if you say, oh, well, I was in France and I didn't like the way they did that. That's just the opposite of the ethos I got out of when I was traveling in Dartmouth was you have to go and just sort of try to understand what is going on. And it doesn't always work. You might say, I went to this country, I just couldn't handle the level of noise. Like anybody's ever been, for example, to some countries in East Asia, there's just the cars and the mopeds, it's like you step out of the street, you might say, well, I can't actually, that's uncomfortable to me, but not in a judgmental way. You just say, well, that's not for me. So I think that something that I've tried to carry with me, but I'm not sure if I saw that as a barrier. But I think that the hardest thing about being out working is maybe what you said. Every day when you're at the office or you're in your job, people have stuff going on in their lives. You don't necessarily know what it is, but they're dealing with stuff. It's interesting you say about traveling, being a woman. I know my wife resents that she can't do the kind of international travel, for example, that I can't in the same way. But trying to be aware that everybody brings something to their work that you don't know what that necessarily is.
Can you give me an example of that, when you've come up against that as a challenge, either in the work life or otherwise? Has it ever gotten in the way of you being effective in your job?
Well, let me think of a story. This wasn't actually about me, but I was in a negotiation. It was a phone negotiation a long time ago, way before COVID. And one of the people on the other side, it was multi-party negotiation. People were raising points. Some of them were more important than others. And this one guy he just goes off. He started almost swearing at the other person, saying, that is the stupidest question I have ever heard. Like, why are we even talking about this? And it was really like other people were just kind of like raising their eyebrows. And well, it turned out like a very close friend of his had just died, and he just found out like maybe 5 minutes before the phone call, he just found out that a very close friend of his had died. Now, he didn't handle that really well. I didn't really know him. But, it's, I guess the lessons I found that out, I thought he was going through some stuff he didn't handle that well. I wished I had, if I was in that situation, I hope I would handle it better, but I don't want to be holding that against him because he was dealing with something.
That's great. And you did a much better job at describing it than I did. So thank you for jumping off on that. Sarah, how about for you?
Yeah, I think barriers are hard. I mean, I think, probably the first one, and I sense because I have children about your age or a little bit older, that it's even more so now. There isn't a path, right? There are careers where the path is more defined. So I suppose if I'd thought that it needed to be a path, that would have been a big barrier. Luckily, it was a little bit less intense. I knew probably more about what I didn't want to do than what I did want to do. And really, I think I graduated and, one of the only indicators I had if I thought about what I wanted in a job is I knew it was really important. I knew reading the paper every day was going to have to be really important. And if it was a job where I didn't need to know what was going on, it probably wasn't that interesting to me. So I'd say that's one. And that also translates into just openness to see what was coming in. There's always this balance, or I find at least, I don't know how it applies to you all right now, of kind of being strategic versus opportunistic, being open to what might arise. And I think, I probably erred on the side of maybe not being strategic enough, but certainly being opportunistic and certainly seizing what arrived and just being open and interested into whatever opportunity might be there. There's also a premium placed on kind of adaptability. I mean, I think we've talked around that a little bit. Certainly growing up, moving a lot. It's the openness to learning and the understanding that there are different ways to do things and adapting to that. And there is a trade-off a bit between that and kind of constancy. And it's too simplistic, but maybe illustrative to talk about. There might be a trade-off between kind of depth and breadth. So I now am with people, having moved back to Hanover, who spent 30, 40, 50 years in the same place. And that too is extraordinary. I didn't have that. But on the other hand, I got to see lots of different places, people, ways of doing things, to recognize, when similarities trump differences and when differences were just, enriching. I think probably the most important thing I learned early on was not only the importance of listening, which I think we kind of all at least have it drummed into us, but was not needing to know all the answers. And I think professionally, there was a great kind of coming together of strands where, so after West Africa, which was a couple years, the question became, where do we go next? And there were, opportunities actually coincidentally in Uganda, and then that contract didn't came through, and I really wanted to go to Mongolia, but the timing wasn't right. And we ended up in Jamaica. And my first instinct was like, Jamaica? Like, you don't even need a passport at that point to get to Jamaica. Why would I want to go to Jamaica? But it was a really good fit, again, for my then husband, and so off we went to Jamaica. And that's actually when I started with the World Bank, because the World Bank at that point was kind of just decentralizing operations, and so they were doing more and more in the field, and we had somebody who was kind of a very dynamic manager and saw an opportunity and saw a resource and thought, okay, can you come work for us? And in the course of that work was really when I started what became kind of the nuts and bolts of my work, which was what we called in the bank, at least that then, community-driven development. And this was the idea that, again, I don't know the answers, but those people to which you're trying to help actually are always best placed to identify what they need and in many times what the solution is. And I think that was kind of epitomized in a story that I was told very early on, where there was a fairly wealthy Jamaican who was abroad. I mean, half of Jamaicans actually live outside of Jamaica, but have maintained very close ties with the island. And he came home, and on the way in from the airport, and there's only one way in from the airport, there is a place to which people live, in kind of no conditions. And he was pretty appalled that in his country, he was watching people bathe naked in full view of cars driving by. And so he very quickly mobilized some funds, kind of, corporate social responsibility funds from the, and built a bathhouse, built a cinder block bathhouse. So this actually went up very quickly, particularly by Jamaican standards. And he comes back 3 months later after having seen this beautiful facility built, this small, but it was gonna change people's lives. And it was dismantled. And he was pretty horrified, and he was mad, and he stormed in, as we often did in Jamaica, and demanded to know what happened. And several women got together, and they said, well, you know what happened is when we went into your bathhouses and we weren't visible to the road anymore, we were raped. So we made the decision that we would rather bathe in full view than be raped. So they rebuilt the bathhouses, and they rebuilt the bathhouses so that it covered from here to here. So you could see how many people were in it, and you could see the legs, but you were private. And that's what was his learning. So instead of asking first what they wanted and what the solution may be, he decided he knew better. And that was at a time, so I was privileged enough to work on one of the first programs kind of designed in the field in Jamaica, really at the nexus of kind of urban poverty and violence, because that's what was happening in downtown Kingston, where, again, I didn't need to know the answers. We need to design processes and mechanisms to listen and to make sure that people's voices were heard, and to kind of come up with some sort of accountability measures. But again, the solutions didn't rely on me. And that's been certainly true, throughout the career. And a part of the World Bank that that's got increasing amounts of attention, but you probably also, the emphasis, when people think of the bank, they think of the bank side and they think of the lending side. But we also talk about the knowledge bank. And the knowledge bank is kind of the learning we come in and the kind of cross-fertilization and dissemination. So if I am working in northern Uganda on, youth unemployment, I don't need to know the answer, but I could know that we're doing stuff in Tamil Nadu, and actually we should send the Ugandans there, and they should learn from each other. Or we should take, a Thai delegation in southern Thailand. There's a Muslim, an ongoing Muslim insurgency, and we should send them to Colombia, where there's been, successful peace and then reconciliation and then reintegration of soldiers. And that's been just extraordinarily, rewarding, interesting, endlessly fascinating.
I love that, especially the peer-to-peer element of it, I think is so important. And peer-to-peer makes me think a little bit. I know that, in the community engagement development, you've moved into the youth piece of it almost completely. And are there different countries or different areas where that is has more or less interest? In other words, I can imagine culturally, youth as a unit has a different space, or do you go in and make the case that this is the best pivot, best leverage? What does that look like? I want to know more.
So, and again, I don't pretend to know. I mean, I can give you an idea of the window of which I've had. So youth has come up, kind of attention increased focus to youth has come up in two ways most recently in my career, one of which is actually in southern Thailand with a Muslim insurgency, because inactivity and ennui create ripe conditions for foment of one sort of the other. So again, if you don't engage people, then they might do things you'd rather they didn't do. And then when you shift, and I've shifted a lot of my work to Africa, and the demographics of the African continent is such that there is this burgeoning youth population. So for instance, in Uganda, 50% of the population is under the age of 17. So no wonder there's an increased attention on youth, and with limited economic opportunities, with not enough schools, with not enough doctors, with not enough everything, just planning for that population as they come up through the system, no strategy could not put that at the forefront. And the other thing is there's an interesting intersection of gender and youth that I've watched kind of progress. And, gender in many ways, in many situations, is kind of code word for women, for girls and women. I've spent a fair amount of time focusing on young men because depending on the part of the world, there are actually parts of the world where young men are more disadvantaged in some ways than young women. And again, not that the issues, but when I use gender, I tend to talk about both male and female.
Thank you. That was a great deep dive. I want to move to some of your work, and as I was looking over the description of what you do, there was a phrase that I had never heard of before, and I want to know a little more about it. Syndicated loans and mobilization. I was like, and then I Googled it. I was like, this is fascinating. Tell me about why it was invented. How do you use it, et cetera,
All right.
benefits.
I will do that. I'll preface that. I want to pick up one thing you said. So stuff I wished I had known when I was here is I wish I had entered the workforce confident in the fact that I knew nothing and would know nothing, and had spent more time in my 20s and 30s just listening and learning. And I'd know more now. And I think it's typical when you come out of the workforce, you want to feel competent. But I wish I had just said, no, I'm an idiot. I know nothing. I'm just going to learn from people who know stuff. So when the role I have now in the legal department at IFC is I support our syndications and mobilization department. And so part of it is I had to learn a lot. I took that over from someone who was moving to a new position. So they're like, okay, here you go. Go, learn this stuff. So what we talked about it, I was talking about with Professor Novosad. So international development finance, especially on the private sector side, it cannot just rely on the money that public institutions have, because it's a drop in the bucket. And when you think about all of the money out there, it has to attract private sector investors as well. And so what this function at IFC, the World Bank, does is try to get other investors to come along in our projects. So on a real basic level, if we have a big financing package, let's say to build, a wind farm, right? It might cost $1 billion to build a wind farm. And we don't want to lend the whole $1 billion. We might only lend $100 million, and then we're going to go and help find $900 million. And that comes in, there's a constant developing look for where does that money come from. There are other public lenders. The World Bank Group, the bank, IFC, MIGA, is only one actor out there. There's other multilateral development banks. There's Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction Development, Inter-American Development Bank. There's tons of bilateral public lenders. There's a lot of money out there that is looking for a place. So all of yours, well, you guys are pretty young, your parents' retirement funds need to go sit someplace and earn a return so that your parents can retire. There's tons of money out there that we're trying to help to see, do you want to come along in our investments? So that's what on a macro level, that's what the area that I support, and it allows, it's kind of leverage. It allows the World Bank to take its small amount of capital and magnify the effect in what it's doing. And like I said, I think that from a kind of institutional level, the World Bank was founded, as I was saying before, it's pretty interesting, just, hour and a half away, Bretton Woods, 1944. I looked at that date again, and I said, July of 1944, so we're like 6 weeks into D-Day. The Soviets haven't even gotten to Poland yet. They're pushing the Germans back. We haven't even fought the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and yet the Western allies were like, how are we going to do something better than the Treaty of Versailles? And so 1945, the World Bank opens. 10 years later, they form IFC. These are international organizations, membership organizations, 186 member countries are shareholders, with the notion of trying to use the power of public investing to improve the lives of people.
That's great. Do people say, do people want to be involved in it because you've taken away some of the major risk? In other words, is it a more safe investment than going in by themselves? What's the reason people jump on board?
I think that's exactly right. I think that, on the private sector side, I think public investors try to address what I call areas of market failure, places where markets have difficulty pricing risk, difficulty going. That could be country risk. That could be some elements of gender finance. Women-owned businesses tend to have trouble getting financing. It could also be climate risk. I mean, the private sector historically has a difficult time properly addressing climate and environmental issues. And public institutions like IFC and the World Bank can do that. And other investors come in under our umbrella, either our umbrella or our penumbra. They say, well, if we're there together, this is likely to go better. And, they're looking for, we're an investment, we're not a grant-making institution. We lend for an interest rate. Other investors are also looking for a return, but that makes these organizations, ours and others, sustainable. Means we don't have to go back every year for a budget allocation. We are able to do our work and contribute on a sustainable basis.
Thank you. Thanks for broadening at least my understanding of that. Maybe you all knew about this already. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to turn to Q&A now. We have quite a few people online right now who hopefully have been asking a few questions. Not yet? No, it's so quiet. It's time to stop being quiet and ask questions. I'm going to go ahead and share the mic here. And please raise your hand. We'll come around with questions.
Thank you. It was wonderful to listen to you. I'm sorry, I think my voice is a bit weird today, but anyways. So I wanted to ask one question about the role of the World Bank in terms of economic growth and also especially development in countries in Asia, Africa. So just a question is that, based on your experience, especially in the sector of development and economic growth, the way that the World Bank is approaching in order that countries should have economic growth, so there are one way is that they are helping in a macro level. There is another way of sending money in form of remittances, I guess. And it's almost, though it's more coming from the nationals of the same country that they are living in other countries, and then helping the country in a micro level. And also I think there is just sending a bunch of cash, so I get. So how has been, which of the ways, or if there's any other way, sure there is, I don't know, which of the ways has been most successful in terms of that the country should have economic growth or development? At the same time, there should be also some sort of democratization and building of institutions and state capacity. And also, if there is any other way that you are personally proposing based on your knowledge or experience in this field. Thank you. Either of you could answer, or both of you could answer, hopefully, yeah.
I'll start. Okay, so that is, I think you...
the development economics professor.
Yeah, right. So you've basically asked the question that is why set up the World Bank? I mean, that's exactly the question. The question is what are we for? What is the World Bank for? By the way, I did want to say this at the beginning. I'm here speaking in my personal capacity. I'm not officially representing the World Bank, and I'm sure neither is Sarah. But I think that the basic notion is in development finance, especially with the World Bank, so that the World Bank is set up to support sovereigns. I mean, very, very simply put, it's set up to start lending money to countries to rebuild after the Second World War. The first borrower of the World Bank was France, I think, to rebuild a port that was bombed in the war, okay? So IFC is set up to support, to be complementary to the work of the World Bank. So very simplistically, if you have a country that wants to have big infrastructure publicly funded, the World Bank could finance that. At the same time, on the private sector side, there can be private sector investment in companies that are in that country creating jobs. We know, I mean, I think people who, like us, who grew up in the United States, a lot of Americans tend to take infrastructure for granted, but people can't get to their jobs if they can't drive on roads. Roads tend to be publicly funded. You know, people, when they get sick, they need to go to hospital. Often hospitals, there's a lot of public infrastructure. So the two are complementary. And I think that's the concept behind the World Bank Group. I think, I'm going to go out on a limb here, but I'm going to say after probably Robert McNamara probably started, where the sense that he was president of the World Bank starting after 1968. You may know he was Secretary of State during Vietnam, so he was a very controversial figure. But I think he started this notion that, you know, the World Bank, infrastructure is really important, but we really got to start addressing issues of poverty. And that's where I think you talked about the knowledge bank. The World Bank Group is interested in sustainability. It's interested in making sure that there's human capital is addressed, not just physical capital. And so all those things need to be, if you look at a success story, I mean, all countries have their hiccups, but, you know, we'll start with some of the success stories. When, as late as the 1980s, Portugal was a borrower country. I mean, Portugal was a country that was borrowing money from the World Bank and borrowing money from IFC. It is now they call it graduated. There's a number of countries like that where the intervention of the support of the public lending institutions helped a country get to the point where it's no longer, where it has sort of switched over to the other side to being what we might call a donor country. So I don't know if that's helpful, and I don't know if you want to add to that.
I think the only thing I would add is that, you know, one thing that distinguishes these development banks is that, you know, our client is government. It's not like bilateral organizations, right, who, you know, the U.S. can come in, you know, through USAID or the Gates Foundation come and they can have an independent agenda and they can work with people in those countries. The World Bank Group lends to governments, and those governments sit on the board of the World Bank Group. So they both own it and benefit from it. And that is done, so it's not, you know, the World Bank Group's strategy is done based on the national development priorities and then kind of the comparative advantages of the World Bank in that particular country, which may be its experience, it may be what other organizations are doing in that country. It may be, you know, our learning from elsewhere about how a country evolves from a low-income country to a middle-income country. You know, the World Bank has spent a lot of time, and this is an interesting. It's a bit interesting because I've certainly been in countries where actually people, nationals of that country have asked, please have the World Bank involved and please bring with you your procurement regulations, your financial management regulations, and particularly your environmental and social safeguards. So we come in with a fairly, with a completely, you know, it is a set or it's frameworks that govern those areas, which are non-negotiable. And I think that's one of the things that an organization of that size can do. So we cannot build a dam, for instance, or we cannot finance the building of a dam, and we do less of that than we used to do, where we don't take into account, you know, who's going to be affected. Are we going to move people? If you're going to relocate those people, they have to be compensated so that their lives are at least as good, if not better than they were. It's that set of conditions that, because of the size of the bank and the way it operates, it is a pretty important part, I think, of World Bank financing.
Yes.
Hi. So you guys both have postgraduate degrees, and I'm just curious, do you think it was valuable to take time off between your undergraduate education and then your graduate education?
Yes.
before and like what what advice would you give to a college student interested in going to either law school or other graduate school?
Yeah, I think short answer, and I'll give the non-politically sensitive. So I took 3 years off. I mean, I did 2. I applied. I deferred for the year, and I went. Actually, the Kennedy School, which at that point had both a master's in public policy program that's kind of the core curriculum of, it's very much like a business school curriculum, only the examples are applied to public sector. It also had a mid-career master's in public administration. I found a letter I wrote to my parents recently, which confirmed what I remember, which is the MPP students, largely who had come directly out, had nothing to contribute of interest. Whereas, again, because we're looking at things like, how does the Nicaraguan Water Authority price water? And, you can tell me coming out of that the economic model for that, and that's great. But who's going to add the political economy factor of what it's like to be the minister of water in that country? So experience is always great. Growing up is always good.
So I was an 86 undergrad, 96 law grad. And that was, I would say to anybody in law particularly, unless you think you want to be, for example, a trial lawyer. If you say, I'm the president of the debate club and I always wanted to do that, all I want to do is be in court, maybe that's kind of go straight through. Otherwise, you'll learn so much in the work world and you'll be a much better professional doing whatever you end up doing, the more experience you have to bring to a school like law school or business school as well. I mean, my college classmates who went to business school, the ones who went and worked for a number of years before going, had a much richer experience, and then were able to use that experience much more, much better. So I absolutely would. I tend to, if it were my kids, I would say absolutely don't go straight through a law school.
Let's ask the global health person about med school.
Do you want to become a neurosurgeon? You should start now. I think it's different. I mean, we talked about it, trade school. There's some professional programs you're learning skills, and that might be more important for you to jump into. But you might go and get an MPH while you're doing that, or something else that might flesh out what you're doing. Do we have any questions from our quiet audience? No, not at all. All right.
No, we got one right here.
I did general career question. So it was said here that you wanted to actually show us show that there is a right way, right path. And it was also said that you wanted to convince us that that there's a right path. And one way to interpret that question is there is a right path and there are wrong paths, right? So were there instances in your career where you thought I'm on the wrong path, so I'm going to change paths, right? Yeah.
It's a great question, actually. I was hoping you would say no, that there is not one right path. So that was my goal, just to be clear. So go ahead. When were you on the wrong path? Not today.
I think this is a complicated question. I think it's in some sense, it's a very personal one. Again, I wasn't particularly strategic. I kind of thought as long as I was learning, and as long as it sounded interesting, that was great. And I'm a big fan of kind of being opportunistic. I do think it would have been more effective to pair that with intentionality. And what I mean by that is just awareness of the choices you're making, and when you're making them, what it might cut off and what it might not cut off. But I'm here maybe as the most generalist of us to say that I think most highly prized are our communication skills, our writing, our speaking, is the ability to listen, to make connections among things, not and don't underestimate, and it's kind of common sense, but don't underestimate the value of those, and how you might apply them, and then putting yourself around people who are really good at what they do, almost regardless of what they do, and learn from them.
I would say that I don't know that this is the right path at all. I know maybe two people from college that are doing what they set out to do. Maybe two. I mean, I've been like a billiard ball. I try this. I think this is going to work. Oh, you know what? This isn't working. I'm going to go do that. I do that for a while. You know what? I need a course correction. I'm going to do this. I think this is the direction I'm going to go. I go in that direction. It turns out, one example I was thinking about, so I was a high school teacher. I really enjoyed being in the classroom. So I went to law school. I thought I would probably be someone who would like to be maybe a litigator or a trial lawyer standing in front of court. Turns out I was terrible at that. I hated it. And the summer after first year of law school, I went to, but I also really was always focused on, I wanted to help people. I want to do something for the public good. So the summer after first year of law school, I was a summer job at a place called Brooklyn Legal Services. It's an organization that provides legal service to the indigenous people in Brooklyn. And also found that there was kind of like sometimes in the area of law, sometimes there's jobs that have more like an emotional content, emotional advocacy, and some jobs have a more kind of analytical maybe approach. And I realized that wasn't that kind of emotional advocacy. I wasn't good at that either. So it was another little kind of course correction. And then, I was at a private sector law firm for a while, and two things became clear to me. One is I wasn't going to make partner, and the other was I didn't really want to make partner because I wasn't interested in the business problems of the clients of the firm that would make me partner. And I ended up, that's kind of what drove me to start the job search that led to my career at the World Bank. So the pithy little thing that's on probably a poster someplace with a flower and a mountainside that says success is where opportunity meets preparedness. And that you can get a poster of that and put it in your dorm room. But there's something to that, right? So the preparedness, like make sure you're good at critical thinking. Make sure you're good writers. Good writing. My high school English teacher, Robert Bradley, may he rest in peace, taught me everything I know. It's like he's responsible for my entire career because he taught me how to write. And knowing how to write, concentrating on being a good writer, being able to present your ideas, analyze, write, communicate. Those skills are good anywhere. And then you need to be open. If something isn't working, then you need to do something that is working for you.
So we are a little bit over time. I'm going to wrap it up with one more question, and then they'll stay here for a little bit if you have some lingering questions as we go through. So 40 years ago, we came to Dartmouth, and 40 years ago, the Dickey Center started. I will tell you right now, I had no idea the Dickey Center was here 40 years ago. So my question is, how would the environment of global health, international development, whatever today, change your path at the Dickey Center? If you're graduating today and the Dickey Center and Dartmouth were part of your life, how would your path be different? I would personally hang at the Dickey Center all the time, but I can't speak for others. Matthew?
Well, I'll suppose I would have left Hanover then because it would have been so interesting here. That is, to me, like an unanswerable question. But I will say that the one thing that I feel that what's my regret about college, my regret is not exploring more of it. And I wish I had known about things like this, and I wish I'd been more open to things outside of my little bubble, And so that's the one thing I would say is I would think about that. Think about, are you exploring things that you might not have yet explored?
I might have known Matthew. I wouldn't have been so lonely. I mean, not lonely, but alone in, I was the only one who went to DC that I knew of my friends. So having other people who were interested or, to discuss those things were to explore, to learn from, it would have been a little bit less ad hoc, maybe starting out.
Thank you both so much. Please join me in thanking our amazing speakers. I have learned so much today. Thank you very much. And that I should have taken a different path, one of the two paths you took. Absolutely. Thank you again. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, folks online. And we look forward to the second version of this. Be well.